Is grade 5 titanium better than grade 2? Is RLX titanium the best titanium? Why do Seiko movements have worse stated accuracy ranges than the Swiss at comparable prices? And why do some Seiko movements still perform better? What's the deal with display casebacks, water resistance, and is the term in-house even useful anymore? These are the 5 things I want to talk about. Why these topics get us riled up, what my perspective is on them, and how not to be quite as much a slave to marketing as we sometimes are. Let's dive in. RLX titanium, Rolex's proprietary titanium used in the Rolex Deep Sea Challenge and soon to be released Yachtmaster in titanium. Point number 1, grade 5 titanium is not better than grade 2 titanium. I know that's a controversial way to start a video, but stick with me before you kill me in the comments. Titanium is a material. Grade 2 titanium is more or less pure titanium. Grade 5 titanium is one of many alloys that exhibit different properties in terms of strength, durability, corrosion resistance, and other things. Grade 5 titanium is more expensive than grade 2. Many alloys are. The reason I say it's not better is that titanium in itself, in the pure or alloyed versions, was not initially designed for jewelry. It was designed for different industrial purposes, primarily due to those corrosion-resistant properties, its lightweight and its strength. When talking about a tool watch, grade 2 titanium is perfectly fine. It's solid, it won't break, it won't rust. Don't believe me? Grade 2 titanium is used on battleships and submarines. If the US Navy trusts titanium in grade 2 on their battleship, I'm pretty sure grade 2 is going to be more than enough for your tool watch, even if you are one of the few people that actually dives in the ocean with your Submariner or Seamaster. Grade 5, where's it used? Well, it's also used on battleships and aircraft, but it's pretty common in implants, as a screw for teeth or as a hip socket ball replacement. Grade 5 is good for medical purposes. You don't need it for a watch, is what I'm saying. What do you get in grade 5 though? Well, you get a higher price for sure, but you do get a material that typically is lighter in shade than grade 2. It's also possible to polish and machine it more intricately than G2. Is it inherently better? No, but if you want your titanium Yachtmaster to look a bit more premium, then grade 5 is likely the right choice. Whether or not that's the best is not really here or there. It's just better suited for the design and the aesthetic that the watchmaker is going for in the given situation. And then there's RLX titanium. What is RLX titanium? It's basically grade 5 titanium with some minor tweaks to certain minerals that go into the alloy that make the material even more inert. Rolex isn't super open about precisely what the difference is, but doing some research, it seems to me that it comes down to the shine, the way it oxidizes when scratched, and a little bit about strength. Overall, it basically just means it's going to look more new and shiny for longer. Unsurprisingly, that's something that's important to Rolex and their luxury watches. That honestly, though, isn't the only reason Rolex does this. Rolex is like Apple. Apple never talks about how many hertz their displays on their iPhones are. They call it True Flow or True Motion or whatever. When Apple launched their virtual reality headset, they didn't use the word virtual reality a single time. Not once. Why? Because Apple wants to signal that they're not competing with anybody. They don't want to invite comparison because Apple wants to project that they are beyond comparison. So Rolex doesn't say COSC certified because they are above, beyond COSC certification. Rolex doesn't say rose gold, they say Rolesor. Rolex is RLX and stays away from competing on specs because specs are for the plebs. They're above that. Water resistance, oh my, this is a doozy. We've got watches that are rated from no water resistance all the way to 12,000 meters. But when you read online, the general consensus is that you shouldn't go into water unless you have at least 100 meters of water resistance. This is basically down to testing methodologies. Water resistance is basically pressure testing, but more specifically, it's mostly static pressure testing. Theoretically, if you took, I don't know, a Panerai Luminor Due and slowly, very slowly entered the water and slowly dive down to 30 meters, it should ideally hold, but you don't. You dive headfirst into the water. That impact adds pressure that could exceed the 30 meters of water resistance. The act of moving your arm through the water puts additional pressure on the watch that may exceed the watch's rating. The testing does also consist of testing that measures rapid pressure changes, and the reality is that 30 meters of water resistance basically means splash resistance. Now, I can find these water resistance ratings and what they mean on the web, but never on the watch manufacturer's websites. The only manufacturer I actually could find that explains their depth ratings are Omega, and they're very clear. They say if it says 30 meters, you can swim all the way down to 30 meters. So to me, depth ratings are not super useful, and they are almost intentionally confusing and should be replaced either with ratings that are actually corresponding to the depths described along the entire scale, or they need to be described by terms of use case, not depth. Where we've gotten used to COSC certification and anti-magnetic ratings, we kind of accept that this deliberately obtuse standard for water resistance because it isn't that important at the end of the day, but it should be. It really should. Google Seiko movement accuracy and you're going to find very powerful comments online, especially when talking about the more entry-level movements that for the most part carry the 4 prefix or the 6 prefix. It's more or less a given that Seiko Accuracy on paper is nowhere near that of their METAS certified competitors. You can get a METAS certified Tudor for under $5,000. You can get a COSC certified Christopher Ward for under $2,200. For a COSC, you get a deviation of +4 -6. What do you get from Seiko? Well, for $3,500, you get the SJE093 with the 6L movement with a stated accuracy of +15 or to -10, or is it +10 to -15? It's objectively worse no matter which way you look at it. But this is also where some people go to the keyboard and start typing that for the high-end models like the 6L movements and the 8 series movements, the actual accuracies are much higher and in some cases better than the COSC standards. I don't dispute that. I don't care either though. If a manufacturer tells me that they will only guarantee me on my car 10 miles to the gallon, then I'm not going to assign value to it actually performing better because there's no guarantee. Fine, your car actually gets 40 miles to the gallon. Congratulations. But from a purchasing perspective, it doesn't matter. Seiko are not promising me 40 miles to the gallon. They're promising me 10. So that's the only thing I can hold them to. This leads me to the question, why doesn't Seiko just guarantee higher accuracy? We know from Grand Seiko that accuracy is actually quite a big thing with Seiko. I would argue that as a company, they are probably head and shoulders ahead of everybody else in terms of accuracy whenever they decide to be. Even the non-spring drive models are accurate to -1 to +8 seconds per day. That's 1 second narrower range than COSC. Spring drive blows COSC and METAS out of the water. So why? Because Seiko sell cheap and expensive watches. Rolex only sells one quality of watch. They've got different finishings and features, but the brand as such is built around a common exacting standard for finishing, detailing, materials, and movement specifications. There's no low-grade Rolex movement. Same with Tudor. Tudor only sells one quality of watch. There are no low quality or super quality Tudors. They are ideally watches that we experience as identical in quality. Seiko, however, sell everything from $500 watches to $30,000 watches in the Grand Seiko line. Even if you separate Grand Seiko from the rest, the Seiko branding, you'll get watches from $500 to $8,000, $9,000, $10,000. When you do that, you have to make sure your watches are clearly differentiated, not only in design, but in quality. A Seiko 5 bezel has to be worse than an SLA 62 MAS model, because otherwise, why would you buy the more expensive model? The misaligned bezel on the Seiko of yours is not because of a failure in quality control. It's because of a choice made about the level of quality control necessary for the price range. This goes for finishings, bracelets, detailing, and of course, movements. If you go online, you'll typically see people say, well, I have 2 identical models. One of them was produced at the Malaysian factory and the Japanese factory, and the Japanese factory has a much better accuracy. That's not an accident, and that's not due to lower quality in Malaysia. That's because the Japanese model from the Japanese factory is aimed at a market, which among others is the Japanese market, where I think the Japanese consumers, even the lower end, expect a higher quality. All in all, this explains why the quality of the movements are different, but it also indirectly explains why the movements sometimes perform much better than spec. Within the space of CPU technology, there's a manufacturing process called binning. You build these large silicon wafers and subsequently they become CPUs. Then the manufacturer will test how well they work. The best CPUs and wafers get turned into the high-end CPU models. So for Intel, that would be an i9-13900. If the CPU doesn't perform to spec, it gets binned and relabeled as a lower spec CPU, like an i7-13700. It starts out as the same chip, but because of differences in performance, you sell it in a category where it will live up to the expectations. And as a consumer, sometimes you'll buy the cheaper chip and you can actually overclock it and get it to overperform because it's actually performing better than the lower spec and it's somewhere above or just near the high spec model, even though it's not intended to be sold as that. I think this is part of the reason for Seiko's differences as well. The 8x movements from Seiko are widely known to be essentially downgraded, or in CPU terminology, binned versions of Grand Seiko movements. It stands to reason that it's easier and cheaper to mass produce components for highly similar movements and grade them for accuracy. Add to that you can save some money on not regulating the lower end movements and doing less QC. Now, because Seiko generally does a pretty good job of making these movements, a number of those really accurate movements are still going to slip through the cracks, as it were, and perform much better than spec. And I think that's why. That's why you can get movements that perform well above spec within the Seiko range. They don't want to give you that quality because they want you to pay for the guarantee of the higher spec in a higher model, so they're not going to offer it in the lower end. And because they want to save costs, they're throwing in versions that probably can perform to that level. They're just not guaranteeing it. And when you get one, congratulations, you won the lottery. We can put movement manufacturing on a continuum from fully sourced, meaning every single component, including the assembly, is done by somebody else. The movement is just plopped into the case and then sold. On the other end of the scale, you have this hypothetical situation where every single component is built, machined, finished, and specified within the watch manufacturer's four walls. Almost everybody is somewhere within this range, from companies like Christopher Ward that buys Sellita movements, finish them, and do some customization and regulation, all the way to companies like Tudor that probably are reasonably close to the definition of in-house, only to trip at the finish line in some people's eyes because Kinesi is a separate legal entity and is not fully owned by Tudor. The point, though, is that the closer you are to this side of the scale, the in-house scale, the more the company expects you to pay on the one hand. And on the other hand, you as a buyer have the right to demand higher quality. Now, for me, I try to avoid falling into the in-house discussion with myself when considering my own purchases. I generally follow 3 rules of thumb when evaluating movement. One is the objective specs, power reserve, accuracy, anti-magnetic properties. These are all more or less objective, almost always stated, and you can get a clear idea of what you're getting for your money. A Longines Spirit costs a little less than a ProPilot X. One has an ETA movement, and the other has an in-house Oris caliber. But with 72 hours of power reserve and full cost certification, the Longines, I feel, is pretty comparable. The point here is that a judgment on in-house or not does not enter into it. It's just an evaluation of the specs. And here the Longines movement is one I, on a spec level, am okay with paying a little more for. 2 is finishing. This is partially subjective, but it's something you can compare visually. You can look at a movement. You can see how much attention to detail has been put into it. I compare constantly to get an idea of what I'm getting for my money. And by now I have a fairly good idea what I can expect at different price points and can spot something that sticks out in a good or a bad way. 3 is scale of availability, or how many of them are made. Sellita SW200 movements are everywhere, like McDonald's. I like McDonald's, I eat a lot of McDonald's, but because I can get it everywhere, I'm not willing to pay for a ton for it. Cartier uses Piaget movements in the Santos Dumont. Is it in-house? No, but I assign as much value to it as I do an in-house Rolex movement. Why? It's not widely available. That exclusivity has a value. I'm totally fine with Kinesi being the manufacturer of a Tudor movement, but if Kinesi sells identical movements to Tudor and Norqain, then Tudor is going to drop in value in my estimation. Kinesi had better keep the best stuff for themselves. These are the 3 criteria that work for me, and I avoid getting caught up in the in-house debate. It's not a perfect model, but it works for me. Here's the problem with display casebacks. It's not the added thickness. It's the fact that a display caseback is a way to raise the price of a watch for very little extra cost. The Omega Speedmaster comes in 2 versions, the Hesalite Steelback version and the Sapphire display case version. The price difference is 13.7%. There is no way on this planet that piece of glass on the front and back costs 13.7% more to produce. But it's okay with Speedmaster because the 3861 movement is really, really good looking. It's intricate, it's got a lot of detail, it's finished well. It's just really pretty. But the Sellita SW200, which is a really solid workhorse movement, is at best okay. Sometimes a watch manufacturer will spiff up the finishing, apply a custom rotor, but it's very rarely a stunner to behold. A lot of Seiko movements in the low end just aren't particularly aesthetically pleasing. I appreciate that some of us just like to look at the movement and see it tick, the rotor rotate and so on, but I do think that those display casebacks are over-implemented in the lower end of watchmaking, and I'd happily save a buck or 2 plus a millimeter here and there to lose out on seeing a perfectly serviceable but not remarkable movement. The thing about watches is that there's a huge emotional component to watch buying. We buy what we like. We create emotional connections to our purchases and we become averse to other things. Separating the emotion from the marketing is a good thing, I think. Whether RLX titanium is better or not than some other titanium is ultimately not really a helpful discussion. I mean, if you like it, you like it. Same goes for Seiko. I have multiple Seikos with inaccurate movements and I love them. But ultimately, I don't believe that there fundamentally is a best watch out there. There's only the watch that's best for you. Let me know what you think in the comments. Like, subscribe. Cheers.